I grew up thinking success meant the size of your paycheck. Every teacher told me to aim high, but they never defined what high really was, so I chased numbers on a bank statement instead of moments that made my heart feel alive. By the time I was 25, I was already working 60-hour weeks at a company whose name people recognized but whose culture drained me dry. I thought friends would understand, but one by one they stopped calling because I was always too busy. I missed birthdays and weddings, telling myself I'd make it up to them later. Later never came. My parents used to call every Sunday, but after a while I'd send them to voicemail promising to return the call when work settled down. Work never settled down. When my father passed, I was in a conference room arguing over quarterly targets. By the time I got to the hospital, his bed was empty and my mother was holding his wedding ring in her palm like it was the last piece of him she could keep. I told myself it was part of life, but deep down I knew I had chosen my job over my father's last breath. That choice never stopped echoing in my mind. I earned promotions faster than most, but every new title felt emptier than the one before. I bought a bigger house, but it never felt like home. My wife left 5 years into the marriage saying she didn't marry a ghost. I told her I was doing it for us, but she said she never wanted the things I was buying, only the time. I refused to give. After the divorce, I threw myself even deeper into work because at least my job didn't walk away. Colleagues became my drinking buddies, but they were only there until the next merger or layoff. Real friends don't vanish when the paycheck does. I learned that too late. My health started to crack in my 40s. High blood pressure turned into heart problems, but I ignored the warning signs because stepping back felt like failure.
Doctors told me to slow down, and I told them I would after the next big project. There was always another big project. Some nights I'd come home and sit in the dark because turning on the lights felt pointless. I told myself I was just tired, but I was hollow. I tried filling the emptiness with more work, more money, more recognition. None of it worked. At 50, I had the kind of career people admired from the outside. From the inside, it felt like being trapped in a golden cage. I attended award dinners where people clapped for me, while I thought about how many conversations with my mother I'd missed. She passed away when I was 53. I wasn't at her bedside either. I was on a business trip convincing strangers to sign a deal that would make me richer, but not happier. That night in the hotel, I stared at the ceiling and realized both of my parents were gone, and I had no one left to call me son. The silence was deafening. I tried dating again, but I didn't know how to talk about anything other than work. Every first date felt like a job interview, and every second date felt impossible. Most women wanted someone present, and I was still learning what that even meant. Old friends had moved on to lives filled with kids and family gatherings. I wasn't part of. I was the outsider looking in through glass. I told myself it was too late to change, but deep down I was scared to try. Religion had always been something I said I'd explore when I had time. At 60, I finally walked into a small church in my neighborhood. The pastor spoke about how chasing the world can cost you your soul, and I felt like he was speaking directly to me. After the service, I sat alone in a pew long. After everyone had left, I realized I didn't just lose my parents, my wife, and my friends. I had lost myself all those years. I thought I was building a life worth living, but really I had been running from the life I should have been living. I thought about my father teaching me how to fish when I was a boy. He said patience was the secret to catching something worth keeping. I had no patience for anything but profit. Now I was left with nothing I could hold. The friends I'd ignored had stopped trying years ago. The family I neglected was gone. The dreams I once had beyond work had withered from lack of care. The house was quiet, but not peaceful. I spent nights scrolling through old photos, trying to remember the man I used to be. Some pictures made me smile, most made me ache. I began volunteering at a local community center just to be around people who weren't trying to climb a corporate ladder. At first, I felt out of place, but slowly I realized how much I had missed genuine connection. An old man named Harold told me once that money is a tool, but when you make it the goal, you become the tool. That sentence hit me harder than any promotion ever had. I started teaching kids basic finance because I wanted them to understand that success isn't just measured in dollars. It was my way of giving them what I never had, perspective, before it was too late. One boy asked me if I had kids. I told him no, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the weight of that answer. I thought about the family. I could have had the birthdays. I could have celebrated the love. I could have grown. I traded it all for corner offices and stock options. I wish I could say it was worth it. It wasn't.
The morning after my 60th birthday, I woke up before the sun. There were no calls from friends, no family waiting to surprise me, no laughter in the kitchen, just the hum of the refrigerator and the creak of the house settling. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the slice of cake I bought for myself the night before. It wasn't that I wanted cake, I wanted the feeling that someone cared enough to share it with me. I thought about the boardroom meetings I had once ruled over and how none of those People were here now, the titles on my resume couldn't hug me, the awards on my wall couldn't ask how I was doing. I decided that morning I couldn't spend whatever time I had left the same way I'd spent the last 4 decades. I pulled out an old shoebox from the closet filled with letters and photos from people I'd lost touch with. There were postcards from college friends, wedding invitations I never RSVP'd to, birthday cards from my parents. I realized each one was a door I had closed without even noticing. I made a list of the people I wanted to find again. Some were probably gone like my parents, some might not want to hear from me, but I had to try. The first person I called was Mark, my best friend from high school. We hadn't spoken in over 30 years. When he answered, I almost hung up, afraid of what he might say. Instead he laughed and said he'd been wondering if I was still alive. We talked for hours about football games we'd gone to in the rain and the stupid bets we made in college. He told me he had grandkids now and invited me to visit. That call lit a spark in me I hadn't felt in years. Next I visited my father's old fishing spot. The lake was quieter than I remembered, but the water still smelled the same. I sat there for hours just listening to the wind and thinking about how my dad used to hum while waiting for a bite. It was the first time in decades I felt truly at peace. I started going every week, sometimes alone, sometimes with people I was reconnecting with. It became my way of rebuilding pieces of the life I had abandoned. One Sunday after church the pastor introduced me to a men's group. At first I didn't want to join. I was used to being in control, not vulnerable, but the group wasn't about bragging or competing. It was about sharing the parts of life that don't fit into a resume. We talked about regrets and second chances, about how faith isn't just for the young. One man named David said he had wasted most of his life chasing approval from people who forgot his name. A year later I told him I understood exactly what that felt like. For the first time in my life I felt like I wasn't the only one carrying this kind of emptiness. We started meeting outside of church too, sometimes for coffee, sometimes to help fix things at the community center. I realized the more I gave my time, the less I thought about everything I had lost. Instead of telling them how to climb the ladder, I told them how not to lose themselves on the way up. Some listened, some didn't, but I knew at least a few would remember when they were standing where I once stood. One evening I was asked to speak at a local college about career paths. I looked out at the sea of young faces and told them the truth. I told them that money matters, but not at the expense of your relationships, your health, or your soul. I told them I'd give back every dollar I ever earned if it meant I could have one more dinner with my parents, one more lazy Sunday with my wife, one more laugh with my old friends. When I finished speaking the room was silent. Then a young woman raised her hand and asked how to know if you're on the wrong path. I told her you'll know when the people who matter start disappearing from your life, and you don't notice until it's too late. After that night I started getting emails from students telling me they'd quit jobs they hated or called family they hadn't spoken to in years. It made me realize my story could still be worth something, even if most of it was a cautionary tale. I also began volunteering at a shelter downtown. At first I just served meals, but soon I was organizing donations and helping people write resumes. One man named Carl reminded me of myself when I was young, ambitious and convinced that work was the only thing that mattered, except Carl had lost everything before he could even start. We spent hours talking and I helped him get an interview at a warehouse. When he got the job he hugged me so tight I almost cried. It was a hug that said thank you for seeing me, not just helping me. That hug stayed with me for weeks. Slowly I began to feel like my life had meaning again, not because of what I earned but because of what I gave. I reconnected with my sister too. We hadn't spoken in 20 years. After a fight about money our parents left behind, I called her expecting anger. Instead she cried and said she had been waiting for my call for years. We met for lunch and ended up talking until the restaurant closed. It felt like a piece of my life had been restored. I still had regrets. I knew I could never get back the years I'd lost, but I also knew I could make the most of whatever years I had left. The man who once measured success in paychecks was now measuring it in phone calls, shared meals and quiet mornings at the lake. I started praying every night, not for wealth or recognition but for gratitude and wisdom, and slowly I realized that maybe the last chapter of my life could be the one that truly mattered. The first real snow of the season came early that year. I woke up to see the streets blanketed in white, and for the first time in decades I didn't have a single meeting to rush to. I made coffee and sat by the window just watching the flakes drift down in slow silence. It struck me how much beauty I had ignored for years simply because I was too busy to look. I decided I wouldn't let another winter pass without making new memories. I called Mark and asked if he wanted to go ice fishing like we used to when we were young. He laughed and said he'd bring the bait if I brought the patience. That day on the frozen lake we talked about everything from old crushes to the aches in our knees. We didn't need to impress each other, we just needed to be there. It made me realize that real friendship doesn't fade if you're willing to water it again. A week later I was at the community center helping repair a leaky roof when a group of kids asked if I would tell them a story. At first I didn't know what to Then I started telling them about the time I missed my high school prom because I had to work late at my first job. I told them how I thought making a few extra dollars was more important than making a memory. They asked if I regretted it. I told them I regretted every important moment I traded for money. One boy said he wanted to be rich someday. I told him there's nothing wrong with wanting comfort, but make sure you're rich in the things you can't buy too. The kids listened in a way that reminded me how much power our words can have when they come from a place of truth. I began to speak more at the center and eventually at local schools. I wasn't a polished motivational speaker. I was just a man with scars and lessons. People seemed to appreciate that honesty. The church men's group invited me to lead a small project visiting elderly members who couldn't leave their homes. We brought groceries, repaired leaky sinks, and mostly just sat with them so they wouldn't feel forgotten. One woman named Margaret told me her late husband used to spend every Saturday fixing things for neighbors. She said seeing us there made her feel like he was still around in some way. Her words stayed with me long after I left her house. I realized that maybe my time now was less about fixing what I had broken in my life and more about building something good for others. I also reconnected with my old college roommate Tom, who had become a teacher. He invited me to visit his classroom and talk to his students about real life beyond grades and careers. I told them about the pressure to always do more and how dangerous it can be if you never stop to ask why. One girl asked what I would do differently if I could start over. I told her I'd call my parents every week no matter how busy I thought I was. I'd go to the weddings, the birthdays, the barbecues. I'd say yes to friendship and no to the idea that money is the only measure of worth. Tom pulled me aside afterward and said he wished someone had told him those things when he was young. That hit me harder than I expected. The more I shared my story, the more people told me their own. Some were younger and still had time to change course. Others were my age and carried their own regrets. We found comfort in knowing we weren't alone. The lake became my sanctuary. I'd go early in the morning, sometimes with Mark, sometimes alone. One morning I watched the sunrise melt the ice and it felt like a metaphor for my life thawing. After years of cold ambition, I thought about my father again, about how he'd whistle when he was content. I started whistling too without even realizing it. It felt like carrying a piece of him with me that winter. I also reconnected with my ex-wife. It wasn't about romance, it was about closure and kindness. We met for coffee and she told me she had remarried and was happy. I told her I was glad. We both admitted we could have been better to each other, but neither of us held anger anymore. Letting go of that old bitterness felt like setting down a heavy bag I'd been carrying for decades. I began to write letters to people I couldn't meet in person anymore. Letters to my parents telling them I understood now what mattered most. Letters to friends I had lost track of, hoping someday they might find them. Writing those letters was like stitching pieces of myself back together. By spring, the garden behind my house was full of flowers. I had planted them with the kids from the community center. Every week we'd water them together and talk about school or the things they wanted to be when they grew up. One girl named Lily said she wanted to be a doctor but was scared she wouldn't be good enough. I told her the world needs people who care more than people who are perfect. Her smile reminded me of the kind of hope I had forgotten existed. The more I invested in others, the more I felt alive. It wasn't about erasing the past anymore, it was about making the present something worth holding onto. By summer I was hosting small barbecues at my house. At first it was just Mark and Tom, but soon it was neighbors, the church group, and the kids from the center. Laughter filled the yard in a way I hadn't heard in decades. One evening as the sun was setting I realized this was what I had been chasing all along without knowing it. Not money, not titles, not awards, just connection. One Sunday the pastor asked if I would share my testimony at church. I told them about my decades chasing success and how it left me empty. I told them about losing my parents and not being there at the end, about losing my marriage, my friendships, my health, and I told them about finding my way back through faith, community, and service. When I finished, people came up to thank me. Some had tears in their eyes. A young man told me he was about to take a job that would have moved him away from his family, but now he was going to reconsider. An older woman said she was going to call her estranged sister that afternoon. Knowing my story could change someone else's choices felt like redemption. In the fall I organized a fishing trip for the men's group and some of the boys from the community center. We spent the whole day on the water, laughing, eating sandwiches, and teaching the kids how to cast lines. Watching them cheer when they caught something made me think of my father again. It felt like life had come full circle. That night as I sat on my porch listening to the crickets, I felt a deep peace settle over me. I wasn't rich in the way I once thought I wanted to be, but I was rich in time and relationships and purpose. I had learned that it's never too late to rewrite your story. The pages behind me were filled with mistakes and missed chances, but the pages ahead were still mine to fill. Now I wake up each morning grateful for the quiet, for the coffee, for the chance to call a friend or help a neighbor. I still keep the old shoebox of letters, but now I'm adding new ones. Letters from kids I've mentored, from friends I've reconnected with, from people I barely knew who say my story made them change course. I've stopped asking what I missed out on and started asking what I can give today, and every day I give something, even if it's just my time, my ear, or my Presents I may have started late but I'm finally living a life worth remembering, and if there's one thing I want anyone to take from my story it's this: don't wait until you're 60 to realize that the best investment you can make is in the people you love, because when the job titles fade and the money runs out, those people are the only wealth that matters.